Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and Cryptids encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by you/the_law_son. My experiences with the Bell Witch haunting. I lived in Adams, Tennessee growing up from about ages 14 to 18, 2004 to 2008. A couple of weeks after my family and I moved there, something unexpected happened. I was mowing on my dad's tractor, with a big 8 feet wide back-end mower. I was going down a hill when my horizon line violently was thrown around as the tractor tires hit something. I disengaged the mower, pulled the tractor around at the base of the hill I had just gone down. My blood went cold as I look up through the swathe I had just cut. Like a buzzer going down the middle of someone's head, making a lane in the grass. In that lane were 4 Native American burial graves. My parents started reaching out to anyone who might be able to help us identify the graves, anthropologists, historians, accredited people, etc. Those people unanimously agreed that these 4 graves were from the Trail of Tears. They corroborated this from what I remember because of how the graves were laid, very very shallow, with a giant slab of stone where a gravestone would be, the fact that they were interned on a hillside to keep the water from sinking in and raising the bodies since they had to bury them so quickly, and many other reasons. I consider myself a very logically driven and rationally minded person. Basically, I let my empirical senses try to explain something before I'll open myself to other possibilities. Yet, there were things that happened to me and my whole family that we weren't able to rationalize with the scientific mindset or anything logical. Event 1. The activity in our house started shortly after the mowing incident. We heard heavy knocking and pounding on the brick outer wall of the house, encircling the house. No matter where you were in the house you could hear the knocking. Some nights I would hear running footsteps accompanying the pounding. This activity happened nearly every night. As the nights passed I started feeling a heavy presence in my room, a suffocating one, like a heavy weight sitting on my solar plexus constantly. Whatever was happening decided to latch on to me. Event 2. Things continued to escalate. One night I was letting my golden retriever out to go pee. We had a ranch-style house overlooking the Red River. The door we were exiting was on the back side of the house facing the river. As I opened the door I start hearing faint whispering, something akin to leaves being blown/scratching across the ground. I looked up at the trees to see if the wind was blowing. Everything was perfectly still. It was fall in Tennessee, so tons of leaves on the ground. They were not moving either. The scratchy/blowing leaf noise continued, but as it continued it grew closer and louder. It sounded like a language of some sort, like how'd you imagine an incantation or something nefarious in the tone of the sound. I looked down at my golden retriever. All of the hair on her back was standing up and she was snarling like a rabid wolf, yet not barking, just kind of frozen in a fear response. I started getting extremely nauseous and could smell sulfur. I was completely frozen when my dog launches herself through the door's threshold and starts gnashing her teeth mid-air, snarling and chomping. The voices were now coming from directly in front of me. I could hear them as if someone was standing there a foot or 2 away. I grabbed my dog mid-air and pulled her quickly inside, slammed the door and threw the deadbolt into place. The door and frame shook violently as a vicious pounding started hammering on the threshold. I ran with my dog to the center of the house, flipping on every light along the way. We sat there alone all night until the sun came up. Ginger, my golden retriever, laid across my lap the entire night, pressing into me while she whimpered for hours. All I could do was pet her and try to calm her down, which was also helping me down-regulate. This was impossible though. The entire night until sunrise, the back door was thumping. Event 3, it happened when I was coming home from football practice. I had all my gear in a gym bag over my left shoulder. This is important, because of how I entered the house. As I closed the front door behind me, I began sitting down the gear bag from my left side, which caused me to look right. The room when you first walked in was our library, where we had a leather couch, chair, piano, bookshelves, and a wooden rocking chair. There was something sitting in the rocking chair. My peripheral vision caught it first, the chair going back and forth. As my vision centered on the chair, there was a humanoid-looking shape sitting there, head glancing downward at the book it was holding. Long black hair drawn down over its head and completely void of light. To picture what I saw, imagine the silhouette of a person, but rather a void of light. The light coming in around the edges of it seemed to be eaten up by the present/void, as the light spilled over the contour edges of the humanoid shape, like how black holes are visualized, almost exactly. It felt like I had jumped off a bridge into ice-cold water. I blasted myself backwards against the door screaming and fell down. As I was falling, I saw the void blur suddenly as it shot across the walls of the house and out through a huge bay window overlooking the river. My golden retriever was in the next room and she sprinted to chase the shadow across the walls, barking and clawing at the walls. After it left through the window, my dog came to me and laid on my lap until my parents got home. Event 4, I was fishing with my cousin Jack on the river by our house. We were right on the bend of a river, so the moon would be shining on both sides of the river, racing out at two lines like a 90-degree angle from the house, super beautiful when you weren't on edge. The reason I bring this up, there was a lot of light on the river that evening. Jack was about 10 or so at the time. He reaches up and taps me, "Does that lady need help?" I looked to where he was pointing and there was a pale woman dressed in white clothes going back and forth picking up stones just to the left of us across the river. I had seen her many times before around the property, and whenever I would get close she would disappear behind a tree or something similar would happen. Knowing this, I told Jack as calmly as I could that it was time for dinner and he needed to go up to my mom immediately, in an attempt to not scare him. When I walked him up and made sure he was on his way, I looked back over and she was gone, but I could hear a splashing in the water below. Event 5, myself, my dad, his friends, and some other family members were staked out along the river bend on the gravel bar beneath the rise to our house. Nothing out of the ordinary at first. It was July 4th and we were having an actual good time for a change. We were all spread out about 15 yards from each other. Each man had a low-end gas Coleman lantern. As the sun was setting, my dad looks over at me like something was bugging him. He told me later he felt like someone had just thrown a bucket of ice water over him before it began. The sun had just gone down when this happened. In unison all the lanterns were cranked up full blast, then just as quickly became barely a flame, then the fires roared to life again, down to barely a flame, roared to life, then they went completely out. Right as the flames went out, we heard the most God-forsaken scream by some woman across the river. Whatever it was kept on screaming despite our best attempts to call out to help. As her scream reached a crescendo, it sounded like what I could only imagine a person's throat being cut interrupted her scream. The sound of a dead weight fall of a human body tumbled down the hillside across from us and splashed violently into the water. At this point all the guys had their flashlights out. That's when something started swimming and splashing around in the water on both sides of the river bend. The splashing receded towards the opposite gravel bar, and whatever it was got out and started pacing back and forth across the rocks there. We were pointing all of our flashlights to where the sound was coming from, but we couldn't identify where it was originating. It's safe to say we were running up the hill at this point. We all got inside the house, locked the doors, then gathered in the central living room. Nobody wanted to leave for fear of what was outside. We all stayed up that night because the wall pounding was more violent than it had ever been. Bam! 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 All night, like the ticking of some demonic clock. I didn't sleep for 2 days after this event. Event 6, Lost Time. I was walking through the woods near the Bell Witch Cave. One moment it was completely sunny and blue skies about mid-afternoon. The next moment it was overcast and looked like maybe 4 p.m. Event 7, Night Terrors. Torture dreams, being held down and brutally drawn and quartered, dreams of walking through the house and the void person placing their hand on my chest and pushing through my solar plexus, body violently shaking in the dream like having a seizure. Event 8, visited the Bell House/plantation marker in a tobacco field adjacent to my family's property. Brought friends to try and prove that something crazy was happening to my family. The rite of passage in the area is to go to the stone marker where the paranormal events happened hundreds of years ago, then dance on the stone saying, "I don't believe in the Bell Witch." I got them to promise that they wouldn't do that while we went. Of course, the moment we get there, one guy who doubted the legends in a massive way, jumps up onto the stone marker and starts screaming, "I don't believe in the Bell Witch," as loud as he could. I get so upset at him. I'm the only one that knows the way back, so I said, "Come on guys, we're leaving." In this area it's known as the Tennessee River Valley. So there's tons of flowing water etc. around these tobacco fields. The reason this is important is because of what happened next. We're making good time walking back across this crop field, hundreds of yards long. A mist starts rolling in from the river bends and begins to saturate the field. The temperature drops easily 25 degrees or so and we start seeing our breath. I begin to smell sulfur in the breeze. As the mist became a fog it began. I started hearing this wheezy and deeply cavernous sounding breath around us, like being inside a cave that was breathing. Out of nowhere we started hearing these giant blasting sounds and I realized something was walking on the chopped tobacco stalks. Side note, when they harvest tobacco they use a machete and cut down at a 45-degree angle, leaving about 3.5 feet of brittle stalk poking out of the ground. When you step on said stalks, they disintegrate in a very loud way as they burst apart. This starts happening all around us like an army of native spirits running around as if we were in a bandwagon battle. The blasts were coming from every single direction in the fog. That's when I hear it, that deep cavernous noise turns into this giant sniffing sound, like some Lovecraftian beast smelling its prey just out of eyesight. At this point I yell run in pure panic mode. We take off across the field trying not to trip and be skewered on the stalks. They dry out and get really sharp where they harvest them. Also, Robertson County is the world's largest producer of tobacco per square mile, so these fields are everywhere. Fun fact. As we are exiting the field and our feet hit the gravel road, the lower center part of my back suddenly explodes in agony. I look down and there's a massive rock laying at my feet and I realized that I had just been assaulted. By the time I got to my house and examined my back in a mirror, The bruise was about the size of a basketball and was already turning black. Event 8. Woke up outside about 3 in the morning. I was laying next to the 4 graves on the property. The night was awfully cold, but I woke up soaked in sweat. We lived there for so long that I have many events to share, process, and willing to have discussions about my time there with you all. It is really hard for me to talk about this stuff without re-traumatizing myself, but my friends and family are encouraging me to share my experiences with like-minded people so I can try to find peace surrounding my trauma. Second story. This story was shared by you/Snexanshit. Witch encounter in Mexico. In Mexican folklore, an archetypical witch is the lechuza or owl witch. It is said a la lechuza makes a pact with Satan or other evil spirits in order to gain this ability. They are often portrayed as older women, and it is said he removed their legs and hide them while they are in their owl form. As a child I was told legends by my maternal grandmother who swore encounters with witches. Luckily I wouldn't have any encounters until my adulthood. 2 years ago. I was in Mexico in my dad's hometown, a small town of maybe 9,000. Our house in Mexico is a fair bit away from the main town at the very end of a very long dirt road. To the left of the road is small traditional houses, and to the right is a deep gully/trench which was once a river, and on the other side of the gully is woods. It was around the time of the town's festival, which was an excuse for the adults to get drunk in the town's plaza while the kids played at the fair. I opted on leaving early as I was tired and didn't like drinking. I hitched a ride with someone from town who lived at the beginning of the dirt road, which meant I'd have to walk about a mile, close enough. 10 minutes into my walk I heard what sounded like birds and assumed the birds nearby in the trees were settling down for the night. I looked at the trees, and about 10 feet up I saw a pair of eyes bright orange staring me down. I was unnerved but pushed on and ignored it. I heard more rustling and looked back, noticing the eyes had gone, which led me to believe the bird had flown away, when suddenly I heard a voice from the bottom of the gully, "Hey sir, come here." I decided to ignore it, but it kept on pestering me until I snapped and walked towards the gully to tell this woman to leave me alone. I started telling her that I was in a rush to get home when I noticed something weird. She was dressed in Tarahumara, native attire, which meant she had a long skirt, but it was not all the way down. This woman's ankles were missing and she appeared to be floating. She looked at me with utter hatred in her eyes. I realized she knew that her secret was out, and I bolted for the house, hearing as a large flapping sound followed me. I looked back, and flying behind me was a huge owl with bright orange eyes. I ran into the house, but I only had a few seconds of peace before something was banging on the door, screeching inhumanly. I panicked and remembered my grandmother telling me prayer was the best defense against a witch, which I started doing, which seemingly worked as the screaming stopped. I decided to place salt in the doorways when something broke the kitchen window above the sink. Attempting to come through the window was that same owl, but this time it was gargling vaguely human words. In a panic I took the salt I was using on the doorways and threw it at her. Immediately it backed away from the window and perched itself on the fence, staring daggers into the window. I sat on the couch on edge all night and eventually passed out. The next morning I woke up hoping it was all a horrible dream, but upon entering the kitchen saw the glass from the broken window, and when I stepped outside I saw large scratches on the front door. I walked over to the fence where this owl was perched, and on the fence and the floor surrounding it was blood. Unnerved I started sweeping the glass out the front door when I saw her, an older native woman, across the gully among the trees staring at me. Her face was covered with small cuts as if she had been assaulted by tiny shards of glass. I knew this was here, and I stared her back down until eventually she retreaded into the trees, and I never saw her again, thankfully. Every time I go back I still place salt in the doorways and pray as soon as I enter the house. Often in that house I feel watched, and other people who stay report voices outside, and knowing on the roof, I know she sits in the trees waiting until she can attack me again. Third story. The Witch Children in the Woods. This is a personal story that happened to me a few years ago when I was 26. I've been too scared to talk about it until now out of fear of being made fun of, so here is my story. Call me Sarah. 4 years ago, my great-grandmother passed away at the age of 98. We were close all the way into my adult years, so the death hit me hard. She lived in a one-story house in a rural town 30 minutes outside of Springfield, Missouri. Her house sat on a large and heavily forested piece of land. There was a large hill several hundred feet behind the house that dropped off into a creek. I spent almost my entire childhood staying on this piece of land and had learned how to take care of it and the house. After the funeral services, I volunteered to stay and take care of the land while my family decided on what to do with it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to buy the land, so I wanted to spend as much time out there as I could. My first 3 days I spent packing up items and cleaning the house. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, so I didn't have to worry about unwanted guests that would get in the way of my packing and disturb my personal way of mourning the loss of someone so close to me. The 4th day is when the odd events started occurring. I slept in a sleeping bag in the living room, and when I woke up I immediately screamed. A few inches away from my face was a dead copperhead snake. It was normal for snakes and other small animals to get in the house, so seeing the snake wasn't surprising. It was the fact that it was so close to my face and it could have bitten me at any moment while I was sleeping. I briefly wondered why the snake had just come in the house and died, because there were no physical signs that anything was wrong with it, so I threw it outside and continued with my day, and the weird event was almost forgotten. Later that evening I decided to go for a walk through the woods to enjoy the nice weather and reminisce about the good times I'd had in the woods and all the games I used to play. I was walking along an old path that led to a well. The path was narrow and was close to the drop-off that led to the creek. I heard a branch snap behind me and instinctively turned my head. I didn't see anything, so I assumed it was an animal and continued walking. Just a few minutes later I heard a snap to my left and turned to look again, but I still didn't see anything. I started to worry that I was being stalked by something, but it was rare to see large animals in this area, so I continued walking. I heard a third snap directly in front of me, but now instead of being worried, I was upset. I was convinced that someone else was out here trying to scare me, so I shouted at what I assumed to be a person. "Go away!" And everything went uncomfortably silent. But I started to hear footsteps approaching in front of me, but I couldn't see anything. They got faster and faster until whoever or whatever it was running right at me. I covered my face with my arms and waited to be attacked by some invisible person, but the footsteps stopped. I slowly lowered my arms, but instead of seeing a person, a bobcat, or even a bear, I saw a gigantic spider in the middle of a web I hadn't noticed before. If I would have taken one more step I would have ended up being bitten. I turned and ran as fast as I could through the overgrowth and back to the house. I was spooked, but I was out in the middle of the woods and sometimes things like this happened. I knew this land and the house well, so I pushed through the night, and the next 2 days, nothing out of the ordinary happened. I started yard work my second week staying out at the house, and it wasn't bad. I'd actually found some old trinkets from my childhood that I'd buried under a tree. While I was picking up fallen branches from a storm the previous night, I noticed a clump of hair was caught in one of them. I remember its color being brown and black and considered the possibility of it being a rare encounter with a bear, but there were no tracks that I could see. I brushed it off again, but I was starting to think that maybe someone else was staying on the property, and that upset me. I decided to stay up late to see if I could catch the person in the act. Nothing happened until around 2 a.m. I remember everything so vividly because of how terrified I was. It started with branches crunching and the sound of the wheelbarrow I'd been using earlier falling over. I readied my flashlight and a small knife just in case whoever it was got violent. I heard them step onto the front porch and pull at the screen door, but they quickly abandoned it and instead started walking around the house. I could hear them scraping something sharp against the house and I was furious. I stood up and shined my flashlight at the nearest window that I assumed the person was standing near and shouted at them. "I have a weapon. Get off of this property now." Everything stopped and I was positive that whoever it was had left, until I heard something slam against the window so hard I was surprised it didn't break. My flashlight shined on the person, and at first I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It had long dark hair with eyes that were way too big for its face. Its skin was wrinkled and reminded me of a naked mole rat. It pressed its face against the glass and fogged it up with its breath. I heard it run around the house several times and bang on every wall, window, and the door every time it passed them. This went on for hours and I was too scared to move or do anything. I was completely alone being tormented by some strange monster. Every now and then I would get the courage to shine my flashlight and caught a glimpse of the thing. Each time I saw it, it looked more animal-like. All I could do was cry and wait for it to go away. Finally, just after sunrise the running and banging stopped, but I didn't dare move until well after 9 a.m. It took all of my courage to open the front door and see what damage had been done to the house and yard after the terrifying experience from the night before, but there was nothing. No footprints, no scratches against the house or broken or cracked windows. It was almost like I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew what I saw and had experienced was real. Nothing else happened for the rest of my stay there, and by the end of the month my grandfather came to pick me up and take care of the belongings I'd packed away. I was still terrified by what had happened, but I had almost convinced myself that I'd imagined it until my grandfather spoke to me. He told me that he was happy that this land was being sold and how much he hated growing up here. When I asked him why, his answer seemed to validate my experience. Now, my grandfather is a serious no-nonsense man. He was the type of person that stayed quiet, but when he did speak you'd better listen because it was important. He was a hardened war veteran and devoted Christian, so things like paranormal and supernatural were just fairy tales to him. He made sure to tell his children and me and the rest of my siblings and cousins that. He told me how his mother, my great-grandmother, would always try to scare him and his sister with stories about the land being guarded by monsters. The story says that these monsters, hybrids is what he called them, were the children of falsely accused witches. The people living in the area back when this was going on claimed that the children were part witch and part animal and needed to be killed, so they were left in the forest to die. He said that when the witch children died, they came back as spirits and claimed the woods as their own, and any unwelcome visitors would be tortured until they were literally scared to death. Just how their falsely accused mothers had been scared when they had been killed. My grandfather said he didn't believe in much outside of his religion, but he believed that the hybrids were real and that he had been tormented by one when he tried to go hunting in the woods for the first time and shot his first deer. He believed he had upset the hybrids by killing an innocent animal and never stepped foot on the land with a weapon, and they finally left him alone. Maybe this is a foolish thing to believe, but I believe that the story my grandfather told me is true simply because we both had similar terrifying experiences. If I'd had a camera I would have tried to take a picture of the creature, or if I could draw I would post a picture of the drawing. I remember every detail about what I saw and will be burned into my memory forever. All of my childhood memories seem tainted now because of this experience, and now, I don't think I'm going to miss the land as much as I first thought. It didn't take long for the land and the house to be sold. The hybrids, or whatever it is out there, can be somebody else's nightmare. One night was more than enough for me. Fourth story. This story was shared by you/Melomonsters. Which story? My family from my dad's side have many stories of witches. Any family member from my dad's side always have a paranormal story. Usually about witches. I don't know if this will sound real to you. But my family has always told these stories. My uncles, dad, and grandpa all have a story related to witches. And some of my aunts as well, and grandma. So I believe them and just am here to share their stories. My dad's family come from a small ranch of Mexico. That ranch is in Zacatecas. The ranch is really small. So small that basically all my family lives there. Usually if you live in that ranch you're related. There's probably only 4 or 5 families that are not related to us. The ranch is small and very dry. It has dirt roads and so on. Once my uncles were getting ready for a party. They were young at that time, maybe early 20s. The party they were going to was in another ranch. So it was a little far away. My uncles being party people, they would take their horses and go to the party. Sometimes they would come back very late. Actually, that was usually the case. So they got ready and started heading to the party. It was very dark, but they didn't care. They got to the party and one of my uncle, Steve, saw these 2 girls away in the corner. He saw them and said that they were very beautiful. They had light color hair and light skin. Being in Mexico, it was really rare seeing a girl like that. Steve then elbowed my other uncle, Andrew. They then walked up to the 2 girls and started dancing. After a few dances they headed home. They said bye to the girls and took off in their horses. They were riding their horses for about 30 minutes, then they saw the same 2 blonde girls walking down the dirt road. They stopped and got off their horses and walked toward the girls. Seeing they might have wanted a ride home. My uncle then heard one laugh, and in front of his eyes they had disappeared into the darkness. They both got back on their horses and continued on. They later came across a laughing sound. My uncle Steve got off his horse and asked who was there. Yeah, it seems stupid now, but my uncle really didn't care about getting hurt. Steve then saw 2 birds. He said it was a really big bird and as dark as the night sky. And the 2 birds were laughing at him. Andrew got off his horse and walked toward Steve at this point. Both of them looked at the laughing birds confused. Then one of them speaks. "We enjoyed dancing with you boys." My uncle really didn't enjoy the fact that he had danced with a witch. So he took out his gun and started shooting at the birds. He always carried a gun with him. The birds just flew around and laughed at him more. My uncle started swearing at them. They didn't appreciate it, so one flew down and clawed at my uncle's face. He only got a little scratch, so he didn't care. The birds flew off thanking Steve for the dance, saying his name. My uncle never gave any of the girls his name. They just grabbed their horses and went back home. That never stopped my uncles from going to parties. That's the end of my uncle's story. It's a true story that happened to them. I have more from my family I hope to post here as well. Might post pictures of the ranch as well, if you're interested in that part of Mexico. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/Ty_pod. My boyfriend is telling me to come outside, he isn't there. My boyfriend works late hours, and when I know he's on his way to my house, I'll sit and wait for him in the kitchen to greet him. The main door is in front of me while the back porch one is behind me. He tends to come through that one so my dog doesn't bark. He called me a few minutes ago and said he just left work and he's on his way, so I did my normal and sat at the kitchen table scrolling on my phone until I got the "him outside" text. After a few minutes of scrolling, I heard his voice. The only light outside of my house was the porch light, so I look out of the kitchen window and nobody's there. "Baby, come outside." Normally his voice is reassuring and welcoming, but I had a terrible feeling and decided to call his cell phone. His phone is a track phone that he buys service for, so sometimes it simply rings twice, which is what it did every time I called. Eventually, I gave up and stepped into the back porch to look outside. Maybe his phone died and he needed me to unlock the door for him. I could feel my heart drop when I remembered the door was unlocked. I start to text him asking him to answer his phone, but while I'm doing this the voice turns from a gentle tone to an angry one. It yelled my full name and told me to come outside. My boyfriend never calls me by my full name, and at this point I'm starting to feel scared. I looked outside and it now knows that I'm not in the kitchen and that I looked out of the back porch window. I call him again. After what felt like hours he answered in a concerned way, apologizing because his phone was on vibrate as well as it not working. "Why are you telling me to come outside?" Those were the first words I said. There was an immediate silence over the line. "What do you mean? I'm just now on your road." He sounded worried, but I could tell he thought I was pranking him. The voice was getting angrier by the second. It cussed at me and eventually started banging on the door. It was so loud that even my boyfriend could hear it through the phone. I heard the car speed up, then the sound of gravel from him pulling into my driveway. I finally mustered up the courage to move the curtain and see if there was really anyone there. There was nothing there, but I could see him running up the stairs to get to me. Once he got in the voice and the banging came to a complete stop. I stood shaken while he looked around my yard only to see a deer running away on its hind legs, just for the front two to hit the ground in front of it as it went into the nearby woods. We didn't sleep much that night, and eventually we plan on moving somewhere that's closer to the city as my house is out of the way from any other people. Sixth story. My dog and I found sign of something hungry in the Sierra Nevadas. Any idea what it was? Nothing seemed out of place at first. I thought I knew my shit and I had a gun. This should have been nothing new. This all happened yesterday near the Sierra Nevada mountain range. I am not going to make any assumptions as to what I saw or what was out there in the mountain forest. I will leave that to you. All I am going to say here is what I saw with my own two eyes, and the two of my dog. But first, A few points of background info before I get started. I am a geologist with a small but reputable gold mining company. My job is to travel to sites thought to hold gold ore and direct a team of company employees and contractors in the use of a variety of technologies, geophysical, chemical, visual, etc., in locating if/where the gold actually is. Basically, I am a modern-day prospector, but instead of a gold pan I have an excavator. Half the time I work in the land of our grizzled friend Ursus Arctos, so I carry with me at all times a Ruger Alaskan, basically a snub-nosed gun that fires huge bullets and absolutely breaks your hand but breaks the bear faster. The other half the time I work in hot, sticky, corrupt countries that a revolver won't make you much safer in. As a geo-nerd, I love the outdoors and consequently travel a lot to a variety of places that my girlfriend describes as rugged-ass. Can't really say I blame her, and I always travel with both my gun and my dog Farkas, a large and hyperactive Malamute that I raised from a pup. We typically tent out in the middle of somewhere remote and go fishing, hiking, rock hounding, whatever. I stay away from swimming, caving, climbing, and the other things that tend to kill you if you do alone. Farkas and I do everything together, and I always try to avoid living through my camera lens, so I have a GoPro harness for him. He wears it around, and if anything interesting happens I flick it on with a remote I have. This time around I didn't have as much time until my next FIFO rotation, so I thought I'd go somewhere a bit closer to home, the Sierra Nevada range in California. A place with a gold industry so I'd feel right at home, but remote enough for me to do my own thing for a few days before heading back to work. You probably wonder why I would go to a mountain range in January. Well, the weather was in the 50s, and suffice it to say I've dealt with much worse on the job. I got to my site on the morning of January 5, 2015, and nothing seemed out of place at first. I was lucky this time and had a nice big clearing to set up my tent and stove and other things. After getting all settled in, I decided to go take a hike around the outskirts of the clearing and the surrounding grove just to see what was around and make sure there were no bears or cougars nearby. While on the hike, I became quite convinced that everything was in order. Farkas didn't bark at anything or seem scared or show any signs of concern. It wasn't until I got back that I realized something that gave me real pause. I hadn't heard a single bird on the entire hike. This might seem ridiculous for a summer in a well-forested mountain area, but if a big predator is around I swear, and I go back and forth on this with my biologist friend, that the small things will keep their mouths shut. This was alarming to me because Farkas didn't pick up on anything at all, and there was no visual sign, dung, fur, etc., of anything big. Eventually I decided to just try and put it out of mind since I'd already taken the effort to get up here. The next several days were much the same. Hikes and walks, some time spent fishing, but I never got a single bite. In more ways than one, no fish and no mosquitoes either, something that absolutely blew my mind. By the end of the second day of my 3-day trip I decided to break one of my rules and pull out my phone. I wanted to learn about the area I was in to see if there were any DNR reports or other observations on the area as to why there was no life at all. Don't get me wrong, I didn't blindly pick a campsite, I was just looking at more academic info this time around. The answer to my search revealed nothing more than an anniversary commemoration for the Donner Party, a group of pioneers who had a hell of a time getting out to California. Apparently, I was staying near their old camp from 150 years before. Well, nothing useful, I figured. And so ended my second to last day of camping. Have you ever slept in a room with a dog that just sits there and stares at the door or a wall? It is a horrible thing to try to get to sleep to, and it is about 1,000 times worse when you wake up to the dog staring at the door. I quickly threw my boots on, leashed Farkas, and took a step outside. The second I unzipped the door I was filled with a profound and deeply unsettling feeling that something was off. Wrong. An uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I had survived bear encounters, but those felt more direct, brutal and untamed, natural. This was different. This was a sense of wrong, a sense of some sort of mistake, not an active feeling as if I was being watched but more a knowledge that bad was around me. You might have felt it yourself if you've ever left your car unlocked in a bad part of town. It was the sort of feeling that reminded me of some of the less safe countries I have worked in. I decided what I would do, a once-over of the perimeter to make sure there weren't any bears or big cats, and then I'd pack up before loosing Farkas with the GoPro on to see what it was. I was heading out soon anyway, so I figured I would be able to review it soon enough. I let Farkas go, flip the camera on, and he immediately bolts to a steepish hill about 100 feet from my tent. He looks at it and barks a few times before I realize there is a sort of hole or tunnel there, about just wide enough to crawl through. I mentally kick myself for not expecting this sort of thing as a miner, but before I can grab him, Farkas weasels his way into the tunnel. Fuck. Now this won't be good, I can't lose my dog. What if there is a raccoon or something? About a minute and a half pass of me waiting and frantically calling Farkas' name before he comes squeezing his way out. He smells like shit, like actual shit, and he is covered in blood. I about lose it. It was like seeing my child hurt, but at least he is out of the tunnel. He comes over by me and sits down on the ground by me, and I start to investigate him and realize that he doesn't have any cuts or injuries. The blood must be from something else. Okay, this could be worse. I am about to accept that some rodent must have died down the tunnel, but then the thought of the absolute quiet of the area and the lack of any animals made me stop and think. A chill ran straight down my spine as I put it together. I show up in an area with 0 animals, and my dog discovers a human-sized tunnel filled with an awful smell and a lot of blood. Plus, that awful feeling, that dread in the bottom of my stomach and the back of my brain. I decided enough was enough. We loaded into my car and drove back to the valley. As soon as I got home I gave my poor, shivering Farkas a bath and connected the camera to my computer. I started watching the recordings. A bit of a picnic with my girlfriend and I plus Farkas, our first hike around the site, my failed attempt at fishing, where there was nothing in the water but mud, an early morning shot of, I had found it. On my computer I watched as Farkas ran to the entrance of the tunnel, barked a few times, and started to paw his way down the hole. It was narrow and there was barely enough light to record with. It seemed like a den of some sort, although it was big enough that I had to wonder what it was dug by. That was when the camera caught a glint of light. I stepped backward a bit on the timeline and played back again slow motion. It was something wet reflecting light, something greasy and red. Like an oil spill, but it was blood. And then I noticed what was swimming in the blood. Bodies. Parts of them, at least. A goose here, a deer's leg there, it was unmistakable. There was no denying what I was looking at, a hand, a human hand. Torn up and bloody. But a hand nonetheless. It seemed as if time had stopped. What could it be? Too small for a bear, and cougars don't live underground. What could possibly? I was pulled out of my mental wandering by a sticky slurping noise. Farkas was wading into the bloody pool and had begun to start eating from it. Not drinking from it, eating from it. The viscera and bones and flesh in the tunnel, he was chewing it and slurping it down. My poor pup crawled down the tunnel of some devouring animal or beast or thing and had started eating the hungry leftovers. And all the while, I stood above ground, hand on my holster, feeling safe enough with a gun by my side, while my dog was, well. This was a few hours ago. I've since called the police and the DNR and have been watching Farkas, who hasn't stopped that shivering but is otherwise fine. Looks like I was more successful than the Donner Party. Maybe I discovered a new predator. We'll keep you updated. If anyone here can offer ideas as to what I found, I'd love to hear. 7th story. This story was shared. U/TF2 Milktoast. If you live near Shiloh, Alabama, do not let your power go out. I'm a resident of Shiloh, and I'm begging everyone in the r/Nosleep community who lives in this area to heed my advice. I know some of you may be affected by Irma worse than I have, but please understand that I'm not trying to steal attention. This is a real warning. The hurricane is nowhere near as dangerous as what happens when you let your lights go out. It's been a rough week, I'm sure you all know. The storm has wreaked havoc across the southern states, and Alabama had been able to escape the torrent for the most part, up until yesterday. Since then, the rain has been pouring down, and the streets are rivers of rushing floodwaters. Power lines are down all over the city. Nobody can go anywhere without risking being stranded in the middle of the storm. Most of my neighbors packed up and headed north, but I don't have the money to spend on a trip. I'm waist deep in mortgage debts, if you must know. So I've been isolated in my home since last night, without power. And, good God, I have seen some shit in that period of time. It was around 4 o'clock that the power went out this morning. I'm not actually sure what the exact time was, since all my clocks are digital, and they all shut down at the same time. But I know the sun rose about an hour later, so it's my best guess. I was watching TV when it happened. The rain had been pretty docile up until that point. During the weather update, the storm suddenly turned into a downpour within a matter of minutes, and the power went out almost immediately. The wind howled as I turned out the window and saw the power lines sagging a few inches from the ground, and as I got up from my seat and walked towards the window, I saw that the tree in my next-door neighbor's front yard had been completely uprooted. It had knocked down 2 poles further down the street, and as a result, power had most likely been cut off from the whole neighborhood. Now, I may be poor, but I'm not dumb. I'd prepared for the storm beforehand. I'd stocked up some bottled water, batteries, a flashlight, and canned food, and set up my old gas-powered generator in the back corner. Actually, I'd like to go back on that first statement. I'd put all those supplies in the basement, which had no windows whatsoever, and was in complete darkness. Likely to be flooded, too. I am incredibly dumb, it seems. In any case, I had to go down there to start up the generator, or at least get a flashlight. But when I say it's dark, I mean that it's completely and utterly black. I'm not exaggerating when I say that you couldn't see anything down there. I started the walk down the stairs, feeling the railing for grip. You know when you close your eyes while going down a set of stairs, and you always stumble when you reach the last step because you think there's still another one below it? That was me the whole way down. Each step creaked loudly and noisily, as if they would break at any second. I was surprised I could distinguish it from the deafening sounds made by the rain and wind outside. Eventually I made my way down, and I leaned against the wall with my hand to try and feel where it turned the other way. I was slowly making my way towards the corner, taking note of the texture of the wall so I could find my way back out. Suddenly, I felt my toe smack against something hard and sharp-edged. Swearing, I let go of the wall and clutched my throbbing appendage, crouching on the floor. Then I heard the creaking. It came from somewhere behind me, probably from the stairs. My heart raced. I heard about how people go crazy and start looting places in a disaster. The last thing I wanted was someone stealing my things while I was down there. Against my better judgment, I called out into the pitch blackness. "Hello." As I spoke this, the area fell deathly silent. All I could hear was the muffled whoosh of the billowing gusts of wind from outside. "Is anyone there?" Still no response. I stood up and found my way back to the wall, now with a slightly more hastened pace. Soon after, I found the corner, and swung around it. I knew it was a straight line from here to the supply chest, and then a door that led to the generator. Cautiously, I tiptoed over what I assumed to be boxes littering the floor, almost losing my balance a few times. After a few minutes of stumbling, I finally reached the chest. I undid the hatch and lifted it open, sticking my arms in and rummaging around for a spare flashlight. Amidst the rustling of the colliding batteries and cans, I thought I could hear a faint pattering on the wall behind me. I dismissed this and breathed a sigh of relief as I retrieved the flashlight and flicked it on. Just in time to see a box finish sliding across the floor. I began to panic. "Hello?" I called out. "You're trespassing on private property. Whoever's there, I have a gun in here, and I'm going to use it legally if you don't evacuate the premises immediately." I didn't have anything of the sort. I hoped whoever it was hadn't realized that. I waited for several minutes. After seeing no further movement, I decided to turn around and get to the generator as quickly as possible. I could have sworn I saw a vague outline of a black tendril in my periphery as I swung around to face the door. Grasping the freezing metal handle, I pulled it open and shined the light inside. Cobwebs littered the place, with mouse droppings and spider molts peppered all over the walls and floor. I put the flashlight in my mouth and brushed away the debris, looking for the handle. A rustling noise came from behind me. My heart beat rapidly as I felt around the machine for the pull cord. Another rustling noise. Close. I exhaled as my hand touched the plastic handle of the pull cord, then sharply took in a breath as I strained to pull it. The rustling was now only a few feet away from me. I pulled, almost throwing out my back. Nothing. It was cold as ice. It grew louder. "Come on." I pulled again. Nothing. "Come on." Silence. "Please just start." I wrenched my arm into the doorway and yanked as hard as I could. My heart skipped a beat as I heard a series of snaps. Then, the basement was filled with the familiar cacophony of internal combustion. I leaned back and breathed a sigh of relief as the generator buzzed away. But the relief didn't last long. It wasn't until I'd cleared my mind of the fears of looters that I realized that something wasn't right. It hit me like a pile of bricks. The lights were still off. The noise wasn't coming from the generator. And as I turned around, I found myself face to face with the creature that was producing the noise. It was freakishly tall, with pale blue skin and glowing blue eyes. It was suspended by what I first thought were legs, but were actually arms that stretched from its shoulders to the ground. It had no legs. But, most disturbingly, it had no lower face. It was like the top part of a skull. Panicking, I swung back around and thrust my arm back onto the pull cord, tugging it viciously and screaming. I could feel the thing's breath on my neck, cold and moist. Suddenly, with one final tug, the generator wheezed into life, lights coming on and power flooding to the rest of the house. The ceiling lights blinded me for a second, and I raised my arm to shield my eyes. In that split second, I was able to witness the creature darting around the doorway, shrieking in a higher-pitched version of the generator buzz, just out of the corner of my eye. The movement was instantaneous, like a bungee cord retracting. I peeked outside, expecting to see it going up the stairs. But it never did. I don't know exactly what I saw, but I know it's still out there. If it moves during the day as fast as it did this morning, who knows where it's gone, or whether it's still here. But what I do know is that, if it is still here, it doesn't have long to wait. I've run out of gas cans to refill the generator, and it can't last much longer than a few hours, at most. When the light goes out, it'll come back to finish what it started. It waits until you're isolated, secluded in the darkness, and then it gets you. And then it comes for everyone else. If you're reading this and you live near Shiloh, please, don't be cheap. Buy a generator. If you can't, go somewhere that has power. Do anything to stay in the light. As for the rest of you, I simply want to thank you for donating to those who have suffered loss from Irma. God knows they need all they can get. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.